I'm coming to you today from the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, and I want to respectfully acknowledge that we are on the unceded traditional territory of the Musqueam First Nation. As some context for today's presentation, I want to introduce you to the Montane Cordillera in British Columbia. So in British Columbia, we have identified 18 different biogeoclimatic zones depicted here in the map. And I'm going to focus on the southern part of the province, and in particular, the southern and eastern part of the province in today's presentation, and talk to you about our mountain environmental gradients. So at the valley bottoms, we have dry grasslands and open dry forests, which are described or depicted in the map as the reds and the golden colors. As we move higher in elevation, we transition into our montane zone of forests, and in the wetter climates and on the windward side of our mountain ranges, we get interior rainforest. In the drier climates and on the lee side of mountains, we have montane forests. And then up above, both types of mid-elevation forests are subalpine forests, fairly ubiquitous across this area. This biogeoclimatic system is also linked to the natural disturbance types that have been classified in the province. And in particular, natural disturbance types focus on the fire regimes, whether they're a low severity stand maintaining or a high severity stand replacing fire regime is really important. And our differentiation has influenced many aspects of our management. It's broadly accepted that in the valley bottoms and in our driest systems, we have low severity surface fires that historically burned at intervals of less than 50 years, and that there were periodic high severity fires interspaced that punctuated those surface fires. As we move to the mid elevations, the assumption or the interpretation has been traditionally that we have a stand replacing fire regime at intervals of 100 to 250 years, depending on the elevation and the climatic regime. Now, this is really important because that stand replacing fire regime has really dominated everywhere except the valley bottoms. And that's influenced the way that we conduct our silviculture. It determines what our rotation lengths are. It influences where we use fire suppression on the timber harvesting land base. It also, at the landscape level, determines how much young versus old forest we have chosen to manage for. It also determines where, if and where, ecological restoration is required. Now, I want to focus on those mid-elevation forests where there's supposed to be a lot of stand replacing fire regimes. And we've made some observations that seem a little contrary to that interpretation. The first is, as you can see in this photograph, we get complex mixed species stands, and integrated in many of these forests are these large old veteran trees, ponderosa pines, western larches, and often Douglas firs. And those trees have on them fire scars, and often multiple scars per individual tree, which of course is at odds with this idea of a high severity fire regime dominating across these mid-elevation locations. So that's raised the question then, what happens if we've misinterpreted the fire regime? What does that mean for all of our stand management and our conservation and our restoration programs? So that's really the key question that my research group has been focusing on for the last 10 to 15 years in the mountain forests of British Columbia. So we have spent several years reconstructing fire histories and looking at forest demography in concert with that. We've presented, in British Columbia alone, we've established about 300 different research sites and sampled over 3,000 fire-scarred trees. And we've done quite a bit of work as well in the southern foothills of Alberta. Today, I'm going to focus on our work in BC. The map here, I'm waiting for it to move forward. The map depicts, there we go, where our different locations, our different study sites are located. And I'm going to use 3 case studies down in the southern part of the province to illustrate some of our main findings. Much of the work that we do is based on tree ring analyses. So Mark Parisian gave us a quick overview of some of the approaches that we take. In the dry forests of BC, we find that these thick bark species like Douglas fir, ponderosa pine, and western larch are resistant to fire. And when surface fire burns around the base of the trees, it can damage without killing the trees, leaving behind these scars embedded in the tree rings that allow us to determine not only the year, but sometimes the season in which those fires burned. So in this case, we're looking on the left at a fire-scarred stem of a tree. And when we cut into that and look at it in cross-section, you see here that the tree established in 1809, and it initially formed concentric circles for its rings through to 1837, when the tree was damaged and part of the cambium was killed by fire. At that point, the rings were asymmetrical around the circumference of the tree. It burned a second time in 1859, again embedding the scar tip where the damaged tissue and the living tissue meet. And the tree spent the rest of its life trying to recover, heal, creating wound wood or healing over the lobes, forming lobes over those scarred tissues. Well, we use these samples from stumps, logs, snags, and sometimes partial sections from living trees to extract this information about historical fires. So let me take you on a little tour of 3 of our study areas. The first case study that I'd like to share is from an area that we know today as the Darkwoods. It's near Creston, British Columbia. And this is on the unceded ancestral territory of the Yaqanuki, or the Lower Kootenai Band of the Ktunaxa Nation. In this particular study, we have worked on a gridded sampling design. So Greg Green, for his master's thesis, put together a 40 plot grid that went from low to high elevation across the 4,000 hectare study area. At each of his plots then, he looked for fire-scarred trees, and each of the horizontal black lines here is depicting an individual plot where we've compiled all of the trees in that plot, up to 10 trees per plot, and the red ticks are showing you where the fires occurred in the past. So the record goes back several hundred years. And as you can see, there's abundant fire in this landscape. Now I've organized the plots in the graphic so that the low elevation plots are at the lower side of the graph. And back to that natural disturbance type classification, any of the sites below the horizontal dashed line is where we expected to find fire scars based on the best understanding of the historical fire regime. Above the dashed line, we would expect the plots to have a stand replacing fire regime. In this particular study area, 25 out of 40 of our plots actually had fire scars in them, and that was across this elevation range from low to high, as you can see. There were 41 fire years reconstructed from 1440 to the mid-1960s, and for each of these sites, the average return interval from fire to fire was 17 to 70 years. So there was abundant surface fire then burning across the elevation zone well into the interior cedar hemlock and montane elevations in our mountain systems. And as you can see, the fire return intervals are much shorter than that 100 to 250 plus year fire return interval that was originally described for this landscape. Now, Greg's study was interesting because he had sampled across a grid. He was also able to map the types of evidence that he was finding and using the presence and absence of that evidence to draw perimeters or to estimate perimeters of past fires. So here I'm showing you the location of the different evidence from the 1869 fire. The red dots show plots where there were fire scars. The blue dots are showing places where the fire appears to have burned at high severity and initiated a new cohort of trees that established in the 1870s. The white dots are plots that had neither scars nor cohorts. So combining this information and extrapolating across the landscape then, we were able to determine or create this heat map where the strength of evidence gives us high likelihood of fire in the warmer colors, and the blue is the low likelihood of fire in 1869. And we were able to estimate that across our 4,000 hectare study area, about 2,700 hectares burned at mixed to high severity in this particular year. Now, Greg was able to repeat this for 33 out of the 41 fires that he reconstructed. And here's the heat map then showing us where the fire was more commonly occurring in the landscape and where it was less common once we had that composite map compiled. Now let's take a look at this in 3D. Let's drape that map over the landscape so you can see how it fits when we start thinking about the elevational gradient in the valleys and mountain slopes on which we were working. And so here you can see that in the lower elevations and on the south-facing slopes, here we're looking from east to west towards the mountain range, and to the left is south and to the right is north. So here, the warmer places in the landscape, the red areas, are at low elevation and south-facing and have the shortest fire return intervals. In contrast, at highest elevation, and in particular in those north-facing basins at the top right of the map, we had very long time since fire, up to almost 500 years since we had fire in that portion of the landscape. Now let me come back to that classification system I introduced at the beginning. The bottom black line here is showing you where the natural disturbance type classification delineates surface versus stand replacing fire. Below that lower black line was where we were supposed to find fire scars. The black line at the top, the solid black line, is showing the boundary between where we actually observed surface fire as part of the historical fire regime. And so here, we've advocated that we should rethink this disturbance regime, that the Montane, the interior cedar hemlock and the Montane forests in this landscape and others that we've studied in BC have a large component of surface fire within them, that a mixed severity fire regime, including frequent surface fires and less frequent higher severity fires, were common throughout this elevational range. And it's not until we get into those more mesic and cooler subalpine forests that we truly shift to the high severity fire regime with much longer fire intervals. In the case of the Darkwoods, currently owned by the Nature Conservancy of Canada, understanding these fire regimes is really critical. It has strong influence on the habitats of both grizzly bears and caribou, two species of interest and being managed in this particular landscape. Now let me take you a little bit further west, and here we're going to go to the West Vaso property, currently managed by the Canadian Wildlife Service near Okanagan Falls, British Columbia. Here we're in the unceded ancestral territory of the Syilx Okanagan Nation. Alexandra Poe did her master's degree here, and you can see in the map on the left that she took a similar approach to Greg's study at the Darkwoods. We created a grid across the landscape and then sampled every second unit in the grid, the blue squares. Here again, she was looking for fire-scarred material, but coupling it with tree ages so that we would understand both the age of the forest and how that forest had developed in concert with the fire history. The study area is quite small, only 400 hectares. And let me point out a couple of features. It's bounded to the east by Vaso Lake, an important migratory bird, or an important part of the flyway for migratory birds. To the north and to the west, there's a rock band, a steep rock cliff that forms a boundary for the study area. And to the south, we find open grasslands and woodlands. And here is an archaeological site that was well documented as a village site for the Syilx people. Here's the fire history that Alexandra reconstructed at this site. We've organized the sites from the locations with the shortest lived trees at the top of the graph and the longest lived trees down at the bottom. And as you can see, there's a long history here. I'm presenting about 400 plus years of fire history. Again, each of the plots is a horizontal line, and the red dashes along the horizontal line are fires that burned and scarred trees, but the trees survived. There's two major components to this historical fire regime. Before 1865, fires were numerous. They burned at short intervals, averaging only 7 years from one fire to the next. About a fifth of the fire scars that we analyzed were actually formed in the spring, in the early wood of the tree rings. The fires, when we mapped them out, were spatially distributed, so they were small patches that burned asynchronously around the landscape in space and time. When we looked at the fire scars relative to proxy climate data, giving us a long-term record of drought in the region, we found that those fires burned sometimes in hot and dry years, but many of those fires actually burned under cooler and wetter conditions. Now, as you can see, there's a significant change that happens after 1865. There's fewer fires, the intervals are longer. Very few of the fire scars occur in the spring. These particular fires during the 20th century burned almost exclusively during hot, dry years. And when we mapped them out, most of them started down near the lake edge. We've given careful thought and looked at the human history of these sites and concluded that over time, this has been a human ignition limited fire regime. It's hot and dry in the Okanagan. There's sufficient fuels at the site to sustain fire in just about any year, as we've seen with recent wildfires in the Okanagan region. And yet we think the ignitions here were largely being influenced by people. Prior to 1865, the oral history of the Syilx people shared by Annie Kruger, shown here, a firekeeper, a knowledge holder and firekeeper from the Penticton Band, says that fire was used by the Syilx Nation in order to cultivate food and medicinal crops, to create forage for game, and that fire was used as a cleansing agent in a give and take reciprocal relationship with the land. And so the patterns of fires and the frequency of fires that we've seen prior to 1865 largely reflects and supports that oral history. So what happened in 1865? Well, here's the heartbreaking story that comes with colonization of this landscape. In 1865, the mid-1860s, smallpox swept through the Okanagan, and many people who lived at this village site were killed by the disease. And the survivors moved north, either to Penticton or south to Osoyoos. At that same time, of course, with settlement, Indigenous people were removed from their traditional territories, and they were forced to live on reserves, reinforced by the residential school system. Laws were changed that made it punishable by death if fires were intentionally started on the land. And so we see a fire gap. We see an absence of fire until the early 1900s. So what changed? In the early 1900s, the Kettle Valley Railway was first surveyed and then installed along the western lake edge at West Vaso. And so we see, starting after the railway was installed and the rails began to be used, that in hot, dry years, fires ignited along the edge of the lake and spread upslope through the study area. These were human ignited by accident. Sparks off the railway is what we have hypothesized. So as we've disrupted this fire regime, we've also seen changes in the forest as a result. The graphic at the bottom here is a histogram showing the patterns of tree establishment through time. And you can see prior to 1865, there were very few trees that established per decade. Those trees, in fact, are the large veteran trees that we see, the ponderosa pines and the Douglas firs that are large diameter and scattered across the study area. In absence of fire, in that gap between the 1860s and the early 1900s, there's a large pulse of trees that established. There's a little bit of a dip after that widespread fire and the drought of the 1930s. And then we've had continuous ingress and survival of trees over the 20th century. So whereas the historical fire regime left scattered trees and open conditions in this landscape, we see today infrequent but widespread fires, and in the interim period, an ingress of trees and their high survivorship, leading to dense forests that today would sustain a high severity fire, given the fuel loads that we have observed. For my third case study, I want to take us back to Cranbrook. Had we been meeting in person a year ago, we would have been based in Cranbrook and surrounded by the forests that I want to speak about next. So here we are in the Rocky Mountain Trench in the unceded territory of the Yakut Aiknukliet and the Takam people, the Tanaha people, of the area surrounding Cranbrook. And so here, what I want to share is again, a study by Greg Green for his doctoral degree. The yellow dots on the left are showing the 20 study sites where he has reconstructed fire history and forest dynamics. And the tree on the right is a partial cross-section from a ponderosa pine, and it's showing you the scars embedded on this tree. This particular ponderosa pine had 52 fire scars, and those scars dated from the late or early 1400s to the 1890s. Now, I've described it here as the record ponderosa pine. Not only is it record in our study area, but after consulting our collaborators and colleagues south of the border, we think this is the record ponderosa pine for all of Western North America. 52 fire scars on an individual tree here in Southeast British Columbia on the edge of the Tobacco Plains. This tree itself hints at the rich and long fire history that Greg has reconstructed. And here's the fire chart from his 20 sites. Notice that this part of the chart dates back to 1400 through to the present. And it's showing you then 600 years of fire history with abundant fire at all 20 of the sites. Here, surface fires were the norm. Very few moderate to high severity fires were reconstructed across these 20 sites. We recorded across the 20 plots 623 fires between the year 1207 to the 1960s. Each and every one of these sites burned on average once every 7 to 15 years. And yet they haven't burned for 50 to 140 years. So these sites have skipped either somewhere between 3 to 20 fire return intervals had the historical fire regime been maintained. So Greg has produced this really beautiful infographic to summarize his findings for the Rocky Mountain Trench. His reconstructions of both fire and the history of the forests have allowed him to reconstruct what we think the pre-colonization forests look like. His 20 sites ranged in density from 70 to 360 trees per hectare, and they were dominated by ponderosa pine and western larch. With those surface fires burning frequently, we would see in the short fire-free intervals seedlings begin to establish, but they would have died in the subsequent fires at such short intervals. And so we believe this was an indigenous influenced fire regime, creating a high frequency of fire, but low intensity fires for the most part. And that fire record gives us evidence of 800 years of this rather metastable condition where surface fires were maintaining these open forest conditions. With the changes with European colonization at the end of the 1800s to early 1900s, we disrupt this pattern of metastability. And so here we have trees, as the last fires burned and the seedlings began to establish, those seedlings were allowed to persist. They were facilitated by both selective harvesting and in particular high grading of the large ponderosa pines and western larches, as well as some Douglas firs from the area or from the stands. And that combination of selective harvesting and surface fires, either before or after the harvesting, exposed mineral soil and provided opportunities for colonization or establishment of high densities of seedlings, primarily Douglas fir. We have then, during the 20th century, a period of cooler and wetter conditions that allowed those seedlings to persist and grow. And then, of course, fire exclusion and fire suppression, legacies of that European colonization, allowed those cohorts to persist. And so our reconstruction shows that today's stands are much denser. And when we look at the contemporary forests, in contrast to those open forests of the pre-colonization era, today's forests have 870 to 14,000 trees per hectare across these 20 sites. The understory trees are very, very high density, but small, less than 10 centimeters in diameter, but 100 years old. They're essentially respiring to death, but collectively they're outcompeting the canopy trees for the soil moisture, which is a limiting factor in this environment. And so we see our canopy trees and the veteran trees, the legacies of those pre-colonization forests, are stressed, in decline, and often dying in years of drought and increasingly susceptible to insects. These contemporary forests, with their high density, are low in terms of productivity. They're not sequestering or storing carbon effectively. They're low quality habitat for wildlife. They're high fuel hazards, and they create risk on the landscape. These are the stands that are at highest risk, put our landscapes at highest risk when we think about fire and its impacts to both communities and to ecosystems. So let me come back to the premise of the study that we have been doing. You know, we've really been able to reveal, I think, that historically mixed severity fire regimes dominated in our montane forests, that surface fires were an important part of the historical fire regime from low to mid and even into some of the drier subalpine forests in our mountain systems. It's those surface fires that are currently missing from the landscape. They're the ones that are easy to suppress, and therefore they are asymmetrically impacted by our fire exclusion and suppression effects. Historically, those fires resulted both from lightning and from human ignitions. And their impacts in terms of driving forest dynamics are really critical. In absence of those fires, we've seen dramatic change in terms of species composition, densities, fuel hazards, and fire risk. This opens up opportunities for us as well. By improving our knowledge about the disturbance regime, we can think carefully and diversify our silvicultural systems. I think we need to think carefully about our old growth strategies of putting boundaries around old forests and then trying to prevent disturbance from impacting them, when in fact it was those low severity disturbances that created and drove those systems in the first place. What I'm advocating for is proactive management and significant changes to our forest and fire management in order to achieve resilient systems and to restore those that have been so altered. So I'll conclude here by reiterating a message that I've sent many times since 2017 and 2018, the catastrophic fires in BC. Transformative change is urgently needed now. We need to act so that our forests and our communities will be resilient as climate continues to change. And we need to learn to coexist with fire. The tools are available to us. We can use Indigenous knowledge and Western science, two important themes of this particular conference, and I'm thrilled to see them coming together in such open conversations this week. And I've listed at the bottom many of the tools and management actions that we already are using. And I'm going to advocate that we use them more broadly on our landscapes and then monitor and maintain or measure those responses so that we can adapt as we will need to in the future. And thank you. I'd be glad to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Lori. You've given us, like all the other speakers, so much to think about, and I think we have time for a question or two before we transition to the breakout sessions. And I think that's a perfect way for us to segue into that. Randy Harris has asked, Lori, how can we access all these studies that you refer to? Which is exactly the question I was actually hoping someone would ask. So thank you, Randy.
Hi, Randy. Thank you. Some of them I think we've sent over to you guys, various master's theses and PhD theses. Greg Green's is being submitted to his external examiner this week, so we hope to have that one being added to the network and to the library with the Rocky Mountain Trench Society as one of the places, one of the repositories. And then many of the papers as well we can share with you, both through that network and then also through our lab website.